We continue to be in a bear market, and so as per tradition, there is a rotating set of topics that people argue about on Twitter. Many of these are frivolous, but some are in fact very important. And one of those is all the discussion around Drivechain, or BIP-300 and 301, and that is what we are going to break down today. Let's jump in. So quick plug, I actually covered Drivechain for the first time way back in November 2021. This has been an idea around for some time now, even further back than that. So make sure you're subscribed if you're not already, because we're covering a lot of these topics way before they become in the more sort of mainstream of Bitcoin Twitter. And some of you may be sick and tired of hearing about Drivechain, but I think it's really, really important. It's an interesting proposal, one that has the potential to greatly benefit Bitcoin, but it also does have some risks and requires consensus code change, which is always going to be controversial in the community. And so as a citizen of Bitcoin, I think it's important to at least be aware of these different debates, seeing as you are a part of the economic set of actors that ultimately controls Bitcoin. Furthermore, it's unfortunately my sense that the Bitcoin community, like many different tribes, has quite a lot of individuals that just tend to sort of parrot whatever their favorite influencers tell them about an important topic and an important debate. What's more, on this particular topic, it is crazy to me to see true OGs like Vortex, again, I'm just picking this as an example, who is stating here something that is patently false. Like, this is just a false statement. So today my goal is for us to dispassionately examine what is it being actually proposed here. What is BIP-300? What is BIP-301? What is actually being proposed? What are the arguments in favor of this? What are the arguments against? I'll give you where I land personally at the end of the video, but ultimately it is up to you, the Bitcoin citizen, to make your own judgment. So let's get into things. Let's start with a little bit of motivation as to why any of this might matter at all. And it's this observation that you have had many different blockchains spring up since the genesis of Bitcoin in 2009. Many of them have been outright scams. But arguably, there are features that maybe we can agree do have some utility. Think about privacy coins like Monero, Zcash. In the case of Monero ring signatures, you might argue that that is an attractive feature that I might want as a Bitcoin user. And so Bitcoin script, the code that governs the different operations we can do on the protocol, is in many ways purposefully simple. That's a good thing. It minimizes attack surface. It also limits the cost and complexity of running a full node and validating Bitcoin transactions, which is such an important part of your sovereignty as a Bitcoin citizen. And so you have this proliferation of all these different ecosystems, which you could argue in some ways may hinder the adoption of Bitcoin if there's a particular feature that a user wants and needs to go elsewhere to get. There's also fragmentation around developers having to learn all these different systems. There's fragmentation in the user experience. There's all these different wallets attached to all these different ecosystems. And so the question underpinning Drivechain is, can we create a truly decentralized sort of layer 2 to Bitcoin in the form of blind merge mined sidechains? And so we'll break apart what each of those terms means, but therein enters BIP-300 and 301. I will link the reference documentation and the GitHub links in the description down below for you to take a look at. And this comes from Paul, or Truthcoin, as many of you may know, on Twitter. And again, this is an idea that goes back 5-6 years or so. Paul has recently raised money, and you'll now see Layer 2 Labs as the company to help make Drivechain and presumably other related technologies a reality. So that's the motivation. How does it work at a high level? Well, first, the idea is that any miner can permissionlessly propose a new sidechain at any time. And then subsequent to that, there must be acknowledgement in at least 90% of the next 2016 blocks, which is about one difficulty adjustment period. And if at least 90% of those subsequent blocks acknowledges this, then it becomes an official BIP-300 sidechain. And so a sidechain, again, is just its own network where users can conduct all sorts of transactions. There can be different rules that govern this sidechain. You can have different features that are not going to show up on main chain. So you have this space where you can do innovative things or implement new features that maybe don't make sense to disturb the layer one, which we want to see gradually ossify over time. And so how this works is users peg in their Bitcoin and receive the sidechain pegged version of Bitcoin. So for example, think of something like Liquid, which is a sidechain to Bitcoin maintained by Blockstream. And so you can peg in Bitcoin and receive LBTC or Liquid BTC, which is a 1-to-1 ratio to the Bitcoin that was initially deposited. Peg-in process is important in the sense that it's opt-in, right? I'm not imposing this on someone else. If you want to go and do this use case with this sidechain, by all means, go ahead and do it. It's your Bitcoin. You're free to do with your Bitcoin what you want, but you're not forcing me to do anything as a user who may not have any interest in it. But the real trick with sidechains has been, how do I trustlessly peg out or withdraw my Bitcoin from the sidechain? You have largely to date seen federated models like Liquid, where there's a large quorum of signers that basically each hold a key to a giant multi-sig, and they're the ones that process the peg out requests. And so of course the argument is like, well, that's not great. Like, sure, you might have this distributed quorum of signers, but these are companies, right? I don't necessarily want to have to trust this group to get my Bitcoin back. And so BIP-300 proposes what is called hash rate escrow to solve for that, so that you have a peg out mechanism that is decentralized as possible. And then the last component to this is BIP-301, which proposes a modified version of what is called blind merge mining. It's the idea that as a miner, I can basically cast my hash rate over other networks without even necessarily having to know about it or care about it in any way. And so BIP-301 is basically an alteration to that traditional blind merge mining process, which creates a trustless interaction between the sidechain user and the layer one miner. So that's a high level. Let's dig in a little bit deeper. Again, it's important to go right to the source and understand what is actually being proposed here. And then we'll talk about the arguments in favor or against. So I'm referencing here a presentation that Paul had put together for the 2023 Bitcoin++ conference, and is referencing the specification and source code that you'll find in the GitHub links. And so critically, BIP-300 allows for 6 new blockchain messages. Importantly, these have, as is noted, consensus significance, meaning this would change the consensus code and therefore require a soft fork to implement this. That is part of why this has been a very controversial idea. Anytime you're changing consensus code, there's naturally going to be pushback from the community that asks, well, why, right? Like, do we need this? Do we need it now? Is there another way that we could alternatively do this? But in any case, you have these 6 new blockchain messages that are basically about proposing that new sidechain, acknowledging that proposal, and then proposing and acknowledging what are called bundles of transactions that would allow users to deposit and withdraw, i.e. peg in and peg out of the sidechain. Furthermore, there are these 2 lists which nodes would then be tracking. They would be tracking the list of sidechains. So interestingly, there's actually only 256 slots. So that is actually kind of interesting. If all those slots are used up, it is possible to overwrite a sidechain. It would just require a lot more acknowledgements. So there could be some interesting dynamics there that result. And then you also have the withdrawal list, which tracks the withdrawal bundles or the coins leaving the sidechain. So there is a very modest increase requirement for nodes, but it basically amounts to counting, which is a pretty minimal additional ask, and it certainly would not require upgraded hardware relative to what a lot of people are running their Bitcoin nodes on today. And so you can start to see actual example. This is a Zcash implementation. This has been around for a while. Paul basically created a Zcash sidechain to Bitcoin. You would peg Bitcoin in. It would have Zcash-like privacy properties that I think a lot of people would find value in. And so you can see an example here of that M1 message or creating a sidechain proposal. You can see some of the details. So this generates a sidechain proposal to be included in the next block mined by this miner. And then you have this acknowledgement. So again, any miner can propose a new sidechain at any time. And upon seeing that properly formatted M1 message, you would then need to have the acknowledgement in 90% of the following 2016 blocks. And as I was mentioning, there is that overwrite logic if we have more than 256 of these sidechains. You've got some important logic around the bundles. So these are like the sidechain withdrawal requests that get bundled up into a single layer 1 transaction. And as we will discuss, this withdrawal process can take 3 to 6 months. So that definitely is one of the trade-offs, right? You could have it a lot quicker, not instant, but quicker when you have this federated model in something like Liquid. But if you want this as decentralized as it can be, and depending on the same independent proof of work signers, i.e. miners that govern main chain Bitcoin, that is part of the trade-off. And so once the sidechain is created, users can then deposit coins. This is a regular Bitcoin transaction, so compatible with the latest version of Bitcoin Core, but they are distinguished from regular transactions as a result of one of the inputs that comes into that transaction, and it is called a CTIP. So all of a sidechain's coins are stored in one special UTXO, or unspent transaction output, called the CTIP. And so every time a user makes a deposit or a withdrawal, the CTIP changes. And so that's actually really nice. That means you're not bloating the main chain. As a result of this, you've got pretty good consolidation of all this activity into this kind of rotating UTXO. And so then finally we get to the critical part of this, withdrawing the Bitcoin from a sidechain. And so basically what's happening here is that a miner is publishing a hash of the withdrawal request bundle. But the problem is that there could maybe be a malicious actor that publishes a fake hash that somehow favors that malicious actor. So what needs to happen is there needs to be a significant amount of time that passes for the true hash to be able to distinguish itself. And the only way that happens in this case is by miners gradually sort of pulling that true hash down to layer 1. And so as we can see, one of these M6 messages or the bundle of withdrawal requests can only be included in a block once it has accumulated at least 13,150 or about 3 months worth of blocks. So there is some additional detail on that acknowledgement process, but that is the gist of how this works and what is actually being proposed here. And so that's definitely a big consideration from a user standpoint, right? The idea that I have to wait all this time to be able to peg out and get my original Bitcoin that I originally deposited. But let's examine some of the pros and arguments in favor of Drivechain, as well as some of the arguments against it and some of the risks that it may introduce. So one of the main arguments in favor is not surprisingly the ability to render pretty much all altcoins completely obsolete and thus build adoption for Bitcoin in a way that benefits participants of the existing Bitcoin ecosystem, including miners and presumably users or hodlers, where value would accrue to these various participants. And so again, you might think Bitcoin is absolutely perfect in its current form, and that's perfectly fine, but the purchasing power of your Bitcoin holdings could still appreciate with additional use cases being supported in a way that doesn't impact the base layer. This is all happening completely off of the base chain. And additionally, by unlocking the ability to permissionlessly innovate, as it were, and test different things, and then ultimately have the things that truly do add value and work flourish as these sidechains, does that lower the probability of ever having to make significant changes to the consensus code ever again? So could this be the final fork, right? And then allow the layer 1 protocol to really ossify and gain ever more trust as Bitcoin continues as this battle-hardened protocol. Those are big deals, right? I really do like the idea of kind of like, look, let's cut to the chase. There are definitely others who say, whoa, we need Bitcoin to ossify around its current user base before we expand to welcome in additional adoption and what have you. But I don't know. I think there's a compelling argument to be made that this would be a huge unlock that could attract developers back to the Bitcoin ecosystem, that could attract users back to the Bitcoin ecosystem who have maybe left for other use cases. And again, whether you agree with them or not, you would probably stand to benefit as a result of Bitcoin adoption increasing ever more. Now, I also think there is another dimension to this idea of bringing these use cases to the Bitcoin ecosystem, and it is that the primary use case for altcoins, I believe, and I think many would agree, is purely as speculative alternative tokens. Right? It's not actually decentralized finance that I care about. It's not actually these other things that we sort of use as marketing to justify and rationalize why we need this alternative token. It is, I want to speculate on the alternative token itself. And I think that's what Paul is underestimating a little bit when he makes this argument in favor of Drivechain. Would you see an increase in adoption of Bitcoin? No doubt, 100%. But the magnitude of that, I think, is very much up for debate. Because again, in my experience, the dirty little secret, and maybe it's not even really that much of a secret, is that most people, I'm not saying all, but most people in these alternative communities are really just looking for speculation opportunities on these alternative tokens. And so you expressly don't get that with BIP-300 sidechains, right? You have a pegged version of Bitcoin. And we can sort of see some evidence of that in the way in which Liquid really has never taken off. Liquid, by the way, despite the kind of federation model for the pegouts, I think has a lot to offer people. It has confidential transactions. You have a high degree of privacy. You have quicker settlement times than base Bitcoin. But like, where is the adoption? Where is the usage? Again, it's elsewhere. And so I do wonder just how much people actually care about these use cases versus the speculative token aspect. But again, that is something that we would see proven out over time. But again, that shouldn't take away from the fact that you unlock all these additional possibilities, you enable permissionless innovation, and you do it in a way that doesn't dramatically increase the burden on full nodes. I mean, really, it's negligible, if anything at all. Again, it's that kind of counting mechanism to verify that withdrawal bundles have indeed achieved a sufficient number of acknowledgements. And then another big argument in favor of this is the potential impact to the security budget. Now, the security budget is kind of a loaded term. I did a whole video not too long ago that I would invite you to check it out because it really is a topic that deserves some discussion. And on the one hand, I agree with a lot of the people that say, well, there is no magical security budget. Like, there is no single number to point to and say, well, we need at least this much security, meaning this much miner revenue to incentivize miners to act honestly. Like, that doesn't exist. However, that's also not to say that security budget as a concept doesn't exist, because it very much does. And there are very much real incentives at play, right? Like, as the subsidy goes down over time, depending on how much Bitcoin price increases, if there's not a lot of transactional activity, and at some point it becomes more profitable to conduct some sort of attack where you're bribing miners to act dishonestly, this is a very real attack vector. And so the beauty with these BIP-300 sidechains is, again, they are blind merge mined, meaning that miners can extend their hash rate to securing these sidechains in a way that accrues them fees. So we increase the security budget, which continues to be one of the main concerns that critics would throw at Bitcoin. Now, again, the caveat there is the same as I just mentioned earlier, where there's really no good way to estimate how much additional security budget this may confer. And as we will talk about in just a moment, it may open up other Pandora boxes that are very much worth keeping in mind. All right, so now let's talk about some of the potential risks associated with Drivechain. Number one, as we discussed, this does involve consensus code changes, which would therefore require a soft fork, which is always contentious, right? Like, it doesn't matter what the idea is, it doesn't matter how beneficial it is to users. Any sort of fork is always going to be contentious. So you've got this kind of automatic immune system response that I think is healthy. Like, it shouldn't be easy to change the base Bitcoin protocol. So that's a big hurdle and is really, I think, very much at the root of the disagreements on Twitter. You see some people saying, look, like, why do we need this now? Do we really need this now? Why don't we let the protocol as it is ossify more for the users that it's currently supporting? And so that is a fair critique. But again, I think there's an interesting argument to be had that, well, this could be the soft fork that ends all forks. You know, let's say 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, however many years from now, someone has an idea about how they can improve Bitcoin. Great. Go make a BIP-300 sidechain, right? And you either win or you don't. Like, people either use it and opt in and use your sidechain, or they don't. And that's beautiful. That's the market at play. So you're providing this mechanism for this innovation to happen. And some sidechains are going to be terrible and they're going to go miserably. Others would potentially add real value for users. But I would say the biggest category of pushback on this has been around the miner incentives. And there's a very good tweet from Michael Tidwell that I will link here in the description down below, where he's trying to aggregate some of the better concerns that folks have been flagging. And so again, they tend to revolve around this ability for miners to act dishonestly. In the case of Liquid, you're trusting this federation, but with hash rate escrow, in theory, you're trusting miners. Like, you're trusting miners not to collude to defraud you of your Bitcoin that you've deposited into this sidechain. And so that is very real. However, the counter to that is that, well, one, miners would have to collude and assemble a majority. They would have to sort of declare the attack months in advance and continuously endorse that attack for months on end, because they would need to consistently acknowledge a false hash of the withdrawal bundle, which, by the way, anyone can verify. You can verify whether it's true or not. And so I think, to proponents of Drivechain's credit, that is a lot that has to happen for miners to act dishonestly in terms of outright fraud. Additionally, keep in mind, like, there is already that type of attack vector in something like the Lightning Network. You could have miners censoring justice transactions. So if I have a channel peer and I maliciously close the channel to try and benefit myself, my peer has the opportunity to publish a justice transaction that would sort of repel my attempt to maliciously favor myself in this Lightning channel closure. You could have miners colluding to censor those justice transactions, and it would look sort of analogously similar to what folks are describing the case of Drivechain. And again, the good news is that this sort of outright fraud case is only impacting the folks and users who have opted into the sidechain. And so given that this is only impacting users that have opted into using the sidechain, I think as long as people go into that with the awareness of the potential risks, then I strongly believe people can make their own decisions and do with their Bitcoin as they will. However, there are more nuanced arguments, and this is where I think things get really interesting, in so much as some of this could start to actually impact the broader game theory of Bitcoin. So you have this concept of MEV, or maximal extractable value, and it has to do with how miners, or in the case of Ethereum validators, can order the transactions and can construct the block in order to maximally benefit themselves. And so MEV is a thing, it's a risk. And so let's say, for example, that a particular sidechain gets really, really popular. Well, this would incentivize miners to actually run node software where they can be more surgical in trying to gain MEV. Because there could be all these sidechains, and because there could be all these MEV value extraction opportunities, and because you would need, in that case, more infrastructure to participate in those opportunities. Again, you don't have to by default with blind merge mining, but in order to do all the kind of MEV funny business, would that potentially lead to more miner centralization, in the sense that you would only have the big pools that are capable of spinning up all these extra nodes and things in order to maximally participate in MEV, which gives them a leg up over the less competitive, smaller miners? Like, that's an interesting scenario to think through. So developer Matt Corallo makes a good point in that we would probably want to have Stratum v2 fully rolled out before doing anything with Drivechain. This could potentially mitigate some of those concerns around miner incentives. I did a whole video on Stratum v2 if you want to check that out. I think that's a really, really important, probably the most notable development in Bitcoin mining in a number of years, and helps with the decentralization of block creation and is able to delegate that power to the component miners that contribute hash rate into their mining pools. But again, while there may be some mitigation there with Stratum v2, I think some of those concerns do still remain, and it's very hard to kind of predict how complex systems and incentives are going to play out. To be fair, if there is kind of systemic dishonesty and broken incentives that we ultimately find, you can undo things with the user-activated soft fork. That would be messy. It would be chaotic. You would go back to the block size war type event, which no one wants to repeat. And then one of the final categories of objection is basically, are there other ways to accomplish what Drivechain is seeking to do? Whether it comes to scaling, are there multi-party protocols similar to Arc that could help with scaling that have better trade-offs? Or are there things like CTV and APO that could help with some of these other use cases? I'm not so sure. So we've picked apart what BIP-300 and 301 actually propose to do. We've talked a little bit about the pros and the potential upside to this, as well as the risks. Let's go ahead now and conclude today's video. So here's where I stand in all this. I actually lean favorably towards Drivechain, but I'm not yet completely convinced the risk-reward trade-off is acceptable. Like, first, it would be one thing if this was so unambiguously helpful for users, but it is hard to estimate the increased adoption this will bring, especially with the main use case for altcoins being speculation, in my opinion. And so thus we sort of end up with a proposal that does very much favor miners. That is for sure true, but it almost favors them too much. And the benefits to, users are a little bit more mixed, right? I do also think there are risks around miner incentives, and I don't think outright miner fraud is too big of a concern given what we discussed. But again, incentives sort of fall out of these complex systems that are incredibly hard to predict. And so given what I just said about the benefits, I'm just not sure that those risks are justified yet. What I would love to see are a few things. One, Paul addressing in detail some of those concerns that Michael pulled together. And then secondly, honestly, it would be really nice to see this implemented somewhere way less important, like Litecoin. Which recall was a fork of Bitcoin, and I think can be a nice proving ground for something like this, to see if we can tease out some of the impact on miner incentives before opening what could be a Pandora's box that impacts, again, not just the sidechain users. That would be one thing if it was strictly limited to folks who are opting into this. But as we discussed, there are some ways that this could potentially play out and impact the rest of the network. That's the big thing. But I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts? I am sure I'll get some spicy ones in the comments. What are your thoughts? Are you in favor of this? Are you against it? Why? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below. I think this is a really important debate. It's an important topic. It deserves to be having the moment that it's having. And so where do things go from here? Layer 2 Labs has a weekly Twitter Spaces. The debates will continue to rage on. I'm not sure if an activation has been written yet for any of this, but the spec is out there. People can look at it. People can play with the code. But I hope you found this valuable and insightful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like. Use the share feature underneath this video. That really does help get this to a broader audience. And again, it is not my expectation that everyone sort of digs through the gory details of the specification. I think it's important as a Bitcoin citizen to be aware of these debates and to contribute to the conversation where appropriate. And if you're so enamored with this content, you want to donate to a pleb, which really does help me continue to make these videos, you can do so in a number of ways. If you happen to have something like the Get Alby browser extension, you can just click that and it'll automatically detect you're watching my channel, which is pretty cool. You can send some sats that way. I will alternatively have my Lightning address and Strike account on the final page momentarily. And just a quick shout, if you happen to be an entrepreneur or a pleb, you're looking for answers on different questions, obviously I'm very active in the comments down in YouTube. But I also now have a Vita page where you can message me and ask maybe more in-depth or pointed questions. But for now, we'll go ahead and leave this here. As a reminder, every sat counts. And until next time, I'll see you then.